Hey guys, thanks so much for stopping by and checking this out. I was moderating a discussion on modern day debate between these two gentlemen, and afterward, David and we had a discussion completely unplanned. Uh, Initially, we had planned on me being in this debate with the two as a three-way discussion, but that fell through. And afterwards, David and I just picked up where he left off in the debate, and I just want to say that it's like 3 a.m. for him at the time, so he was up for quite a while because I believe he lives in Israel. So it's pretty awesome that he wanted to stay up and have the conversation with me as well after the debate that he had with John. But thanks for checking this out, and go check out his channel. I'll link it in the description.
Future, all right?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Take care, guys.
All right, John. Yeah, and David, if there's ever anything you want to do in the future, man, I'd be happy to talk to you.
I'd like to. I was going to say I'd like to actually have this debate, this discussion with you. I know that you said you're getting married in mid-August.
Yeah, next month, 22nd. So, but I'm typically free Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. But a lot of your questions that I heard, I've got some answers for them. I mean, you could watch some of my discussions I've had with Scholar Fiction and others to see some of those answers. But I definitely think that there's a lot of misunderstandings. And I think a lot of it is brought to light by Heiser and some of the others like Daryl Bach and John Walton and a few of these guys. I think they bring a lot of that to light because they actually take the secular opinion seriously, and they say, hey, look, these guys are right. Look at how there's overlap. But there's also things in the text that help us to understand why. So I think it might be a fruitful discussion.
Yes, I'm happy to take listen to it. I haven't heard them because the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims I have heard speak about this. Usually there's some sort of fallacious reasoning in there. There's some sort of special pleading that they're using.
I agree. But here's the thing.
The slavery was moral.
I agree with you, but here, I'll give you a short version of my argument, okay? And I've never heard anybody else use this argument, not even the scholars I listen to. It's just something that when I'm reading, I go, well, how does that not apply? So basically John couldn't use this because he's a Jew, but I'm a Christian, right? So Christ said, he was asked about divorce, and they said, well, Moses said we could divorce our wives. And he said, Moses did tell you that, but it's because of the hardness of your heart, and it hasn't been that way from the beginning. He also challenged eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, which is in the same chapter as the slave verses. He also challenged the Sabbath day and a few others. And the whole point of it is that it's what I've like I say, nobody's developed this. This is what just my belief, and I call it the milk. I call it the solid foods argument. That's what I call it. And it's the reason why is because I take the biblical principle that you get milk until you're able to consume solid food. You familiar with that?
Yeah.
It basically just means like, hey, look, you can't tell a child everything there is to know. You have to give them little pieces of knowledge. The more they grow up, you give them more and more till they can understand it. And basically what I'm saying is that the Hebrews and the cultures they came out of were so barbaric that God kind of gave them crumbs. Like with slavery, it never says thou shalt have slave, but instead every verse you can find on it is about how to regulate it. So that by the time you get to the New Testament, you have a verse in 1 Timothy that says, it lists all the people who are going to be in hell, including liars and thieves. And then it says, and slave traders, right? And then you have like verses like in the letter of Philemon in the New Testament, Paul argues with Philemon to take back Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a brother, and things like this. So that's kind of my argument, is that God approaches people where they are. And let's say these people already thought slavery was a normal institution. And he started saying, okay, if you're going to have slaves, here's the regulations you must put on them. And then as he begins to give them milk, he has the foresight of the solid food down the road. So anyway, that's the beginning of my argument.
That's right. And actually, I do appreciate that argument. And which is why I do appreciate certain books and verses and letters in the New Testament where I would agree with you that the best way to change systems is to do it slowly but surely over time so people get used to the idea. However, that being said, the changes stopped the last letters of the New Testament. I have a Bible actually with me, but I forget what the last book is. Not Revelation. The last letter or book that was written, which may be Revelations. There's more prophecies for the end times.
Yeah, that's Revelation.
I think it's less on instructions on how to behave, where the Bible ends there. And that's what I said to John earlier. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, it's stuck at the end of Malachi.
Right.
And it's very nice that there's the Talmud, there's the Midrash, there's so many other things that we've got around that. However, when it comes to the law and how we're supposed to behave, it goes from Genesis to Malachi, and that's it. And you're not supposed to add to it. There's nothing that can be added to it or taken away, which is where I think it fails. That's the absolute failure, because you can't take away slavery from the entire Bible. You can mitigate it, you can regulate it. However, you can't take away slavery from any part of it. You can say it's preferable not to have, but if you want to have, this is how you treat them.
Yeah. So that's what I would say, is that I partially agree with you that it would be much more difficult. Like when I debated like Scholar Fiction 4 years ago, I believe it was, and we kind of touched on this, he was saying, no, don't go to the New Testament. And I was like, well, hold on. I'm not a Bronze Age Jew though. And he's like, no. Yeah. And that's what I told him. And he's like, it like blew him off base. He was like, oh yeah, it's like he had to realize in the moment, like, oh yeah, he can use the New Testament, because he was like trying to be like, no, don't use that. And I was like, just think about what you're saying. I'm not. Yeah. So anyway, I actually think that you're right, that it is much more difficult. But if I were a Jew, I would just basically adopt a deontological moral position, where basically morals are based on rules instead of consequences. And so if it's the rule, it's moral. So that's how I would approach that. But I agree with you that, especially in trying to convince somebody that doesn't share your moral worldview, your moral intuitions, that having the New Testament definitely changes the game. And
it does.
Yeah.
It does. When it comes to deontologies, though, and this was in my rough draft from opening, it's many of the moral stances, they fail because they take a very black and white view to it. So in deontology, it's always wrong to lie, and it doesn't leave open for the option to doesn't leave option open to tell the Nazis that there are no Jews living under your floorboards. There's no Jews in the attics, because for deontology, you got to tell them, because lying is always wrong. Personally, I prefer taking a more pragmatic stance, seeing what works, how we can progress as a society. I think the vegans touched on it. I don't know if they were aware of it, but they're talking about Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, which has been out for, I think, almost 10 odd years.
Yeah.
It talks about human well-being and ways we can move forward to that.
Do you think that's are you saying that's a good ethic?
I think it's a better way, where we step back for a moment and we look at how do our actions impact and influence ourselves and then those around us on an individual and larger scale.
Have you seen his debate on that moral landscape with William Lane Craig?
Oh, I think he's had two, hasn't he?
You haven't seen? If you haven't seen that, you should watch. Oh, you have? Oh, okay.
I've seen it a few times. It's
Okay,
so too long debates, I think.
yeah. So at the end, he admits. So Craig says that Sam Harris admits in the book that if people could be just as happy with things that we didn't consider to be moral, then it wouldn't be a moral landscape, but rather just a landscape with peaks and valleys of different creaturely happiness or not, basically preferences. And then Craig goes, but he admits in the back of his book that there is a segment, I forget what percentage he said, of the population that are psychotic or whatever. And he basically says like, well, there is a certain segment of the population that agrees that or that disagrees with well-being or whatever. So I think he's right about that, and that makes it not necessarily a moral landscape, but just a peaks and valleys of creaturely preferences, kind of.
He goes into that in his book. I actually do have a copy of the book, The Moral Landscape, where he talks about on our progression to a better society, there will be valleys, there will be peaks, and they will often differ. And it's not a smooth ride uphill. Sometimes there are going to be a few missteps and a few places where we might make an error. But when it comes to those psychopaths and sociopaths, I don't think they should be allowed in the discussion of, if you and I were having a discussion on how we want to have a society. I think it's usually called behind the veil. And someone's going to come in there and they are psychotic. We say to them, no. You don't get to be part of this conversation because of, not because we hate them, not because we dislike them, but because of their mental chemistry. The neurochemistry is like, you can't be trusted to.
Right, but here's the problem. No, I see what you're saying, but here's the problem with that is, then you have to be consistent with that view. And so then you talk to, I don't know where you stand at politically, but then let's say that you're on the left side, which I would assume that you're probably closer to the left, which I could be wrong because Christopher Hitchens was closer to the right. Okay. Well, he was right.
He was whatever was contrary to popular view.
Right, exactly. So, but here's my point with that is saying that, well, yeah, but they're so small of a percentage and that they're mentally unstable, so we don't need to necessarily let them be in on the conversation. You can extend that to say there will be a lot of people who think that things like homosexuality and LGBT and all those things are mental problems, right? And they'll say, well, why should we make laws and things based on what they want, right? They're the exception to the rule. So then I'm saying you have to be consistent with that, because if you're going to use that here, right?
Well, to them I would say, how does let's just go with two people. How does two people in their own house affect your life? That, I'd say, is an immoral situation. It's what you're going to do in the privacy of your own house is not going to really, it doesn't affect anyone. However, even if it's a straight couple in the middle of the street, if they start, let's say having fun there, that's still wrong. It's still going to cause more harm than is necessary to.
Yeah, I think they would look more at something like gay marriage or trans rights or these kind of things, and then go, well, this isn't just something in the bedroom. They're trying to have legislation passed which affects, our culture, because there's going to be TV, there's going to be things on TV. Anyway, I'm not making that argument. I'm just saying that if your argument passes, then it's, that same argument can be used there. Yeah.
What I'd be saying is that let's have a conversation between them, decide we get the conversation, and it would have the way the cultures and the morals would work. It goes by what the majority says. I'm not saying that's entirely right, because the majority can definitely be wrong on occasion. When it comes to the extremists, I'm comfortably in the middle to the right politically.
Yeah,
I try to be as center as possible, but when it comes to extreme right, extreme left, and you hear what they're trying to say and the extreme versions of their arguments, and say, you guys, you're not going to be part of this conversation. We're happy to listen to you, to hear what you have to say, but if your views are so extreme and you're not going to compromise, you're not going to be willing to live within the community as a whole, then there's the door, there's the border. You're more than welcome to have your own land with your own rules.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I agree with you that I actually do.
Someone,
Yeah.
and in the chat, when it was all SUP and strike against Washington Destiny, where one of the guys was saying that, oh, you mods are biased, you're unfair, you hate the extreme right. I said, you're in our house, our rules.
Right.
If you don't like it, fine. Go watch it on one of their channels.
Sure. Well, I guess that's what the whole point though was, is that at that point, it's because I think Sam is trying to pass this as an objective morality, and it's not necessarily objective if you say something like, well, yeah, but the majority of the population thinks that well-being is good. It's like, well, that's not objective, because objective is independent of human thought or opinion, right? And so that's what I'm saying.
So we get G-Man on this?
Huh?
We get G-Man on this with subjective objective opinion?
What is G-Man? I don't understand. What is G-Man?
I think in one of his recent debates, he was saying he has a subjective objective opinion.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't say. Actually, to be honest, sometimes I try not to watch G-Man's debates too much, because I don't think that he spent any deep amount of time thinking about a lot of these things. I think that he goes off his intuitions, and which is fine sometimes, right? But then that's when you get to what you just said, subjective, objective stuff.
Yeah.
But
it's unfortunately, if we're going to make moral law or decide what is moral, unfortunately, it's going to be what the majority says. It doesn't mean, though, that there isn't potentially an objectively better way of doing things. And we talked about homosexuality, and I think, what I've said earlier, it's two people and what they do in the privacy of their own house.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be anyone else's business. And I fail to see how that could affect other people, which is why I'd say it's not moral or immoral, just amoral.
Yeah, I mean, I can partially agree with you that if that's the extent of it, then it doesn't really affect anybody else. Then I don't think anybody's going to say anything else. But I think that it's things like whenever a Christian sits down to watch TV with their family, and they see on every other commercial LGBTQ and trans and gay people and all these things, I think that it kind of, and I'm not even saying they're right necessarily, I'm just saying that I don't think it's as easy as, well, it's what they're doing behind closed doors, right? I think that I think there's a good argument to be made about not normalizing some things that they're trying to normalize. And what I mean by that, and trans people even agree with me on this, a lot of them, I would say, because I've asked quite a few. I ask them, I say, do you want trans to become normalized, like a normal thing that people, and then they typically they go, no, because it's not an easy life to live. It's not a great life to live. There's nothing, they just go, it's the way I am. And I can sit there and agree all day. Hey, look, sure. Same thing with homosexuality. Like I believe that people have experienced a phenomenon called same-sex attraction. I believe that occurs, right? That has nothing to do whether it's actually morally the case or not, because if it is true at the end of the day that, like, for example, if it's true at the end of the day that murder is objectively wrong because it violates a law of the universe like gravity or something, then it doesn't matter if the majority of people legislate that it's fine in certain instances or whatever. It's still immoral to do, just like gravity. No matter what anybody thinks about it, you walk off a cliff and there's you fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, whatever. So
flat earthers, I think, would be.
Yeah, they'll disagree totally.
Which is why I didn't want to start throwing out. Which is why I said earlier about some of my neighbors, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Iranis in Afghanistan, what they're doing there, where and I said, like, let's look at countries that uphold the principles of let's not kill each other and how they're doing versus countries that allow a certain set of the population to get away with wanton murder. And let's compare how these countries are doing. Now, I do know that there are other factors that surround that. It's not just an isolated case, or just because they allow murder, they're not doing so well. There are many other reasons, but if you look at the principles and the values on the whole that they're upholding, what they practice, so you can say, okay, perhaps those values aren't fantastic. And we can look at a different country. I'm very hesitant to use the States because from an outsider's perspective, what's going on over there, it's not looking too good.
Well,
however,
go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, you have to be careful with the PR, right? Because the thing is, if you look at the percentage that people on TV make up in the population, it's super, like, let me give you an example. I seen a report that said something like, although black people don't make up 13% of the population approximately, they make up 80% of people on TV because of them being entertainers, sports players, actors, singers, that kind of thing. And and other people, like I've seen that homosexual and trans and liberal, I think it said liberal opinions make up more than they are represented in the population, right? And like, for example, trans is less than 1%, and you get what I'm coming from. So I think that they're a lot louder because of Hollywood and the news, right? But so I mean, I just think that while I think that a lot of people are kind of shocked by all of this because they think this is, just going on everywhere. But I mean, like in my hometown, like we've got a little bit, but it's mainly just people saying like, "Hey, we all deserve rights," that kind of thing. But then it's like it's like I posted on Twitter after George Floyd. I said, "Hey, everybody, tag me with anybody who disagrees that George Floyd is murdered, and we'll go after him together." And everybody was like, "Well, I haven't seen anybody saying that it was right yet." It was like everybody was posting that. I'm like, all right, well, when you guys find these people who you're fighting against, let me know, right? Because I don't believe that anybody actually is going against that. I think they're just fighting ghosts. I used to say this all the time before any of this happened. I used to use this example where something like this would happen. And I'd go, yeah, but it's like saying all people in prison aren't bad people. Well, yeah, but who is the guy that's saying everybody in prison is a bad person, right? Nobody's saying that. It's like you're attacking some ghost. Like, if you can find an actual person that's saying these things, we'll go get them together, right? But just let me know when that happens.
I'll come with you.
So anyway, that's
Yeah, it is, and I think there was a debate when it came to trans people. Not that long ago, on one of the debates where I tried to send in a question to James saying that, are they more upset, like what affects them more, that they are being used as a political tool? I forget what their names were. It doesn't really matter, but are they more affected by people using them as political tools than they are, what's worse for them?
right.
Not being accepted, or the people not really listening to them and just using them as political tools for virtue signaling points? I mean, that's what's going to keep them, I'd say, upset. That's what's going to cause them more harm than good, because the issues aren't being told to them. They're just saying you have to give them rights, saying that they have all the rights. Name me a right that I have that a trans person doesn't have.
No, I agree. I've said this before as well. I totally agree with you. It's like this is definitely going to be worse for them in the end because of this. Like, like I say the same thing when people go. It's similar. Like when people say something like when I was looking for, there was a guy, Dr. Avi. He's like a vegan. He's a big vegan YouTuber that debates a lot of people on veganism and other issues. Well, I found out that he was pro-life. So I started looking for people that he says mostly pro-life, right? Even though he's an atheist, right? And that's the position he takes. but I started looking for people all over on Discords and different, and so I talked to a lot of my friends that are non-believers, and I go, hey, find me somebody who will debate him and take the pro-choice side. And then nobody would do it. Nobody would step up. And I was like, well, ask this guy. I don't remember his name, but I put it in the chat or whatever. And I remember a girl saying, well, it should probably be a girl if we're debating about abortion and there's no girls there. But I'm thinking like, okay. Yeah, I'm like, okay, so whenever we're talking about white males, you shouldn't have an opinion. It should be only white males talking about it. And like, of course they wouldn't believe that, right? So that's what I like to do. Is I even put out a video on my channel called "Don't Talk About the LGBTQ+." And basically what I did was I went through these comments that I got when I mentioned LGBTQ+, right? This is kind of funny. I mentioned that in my debate with Tom Jump on the definition of atheism. And I basically said that I think what they're doing is trying to adopt the LGBTQ+'s model of inclusivity so that you can build your numbers. So you're no longer 0.5% of the population. So you add a bunch more letters. Now you're at like 4% of the population, right? And I said that I think that sometimes when atheists are defining and they're defining their way out of the burden of proof, it doesn't just do that, but it also includes more people. Because if you're not saying there isn't a God, but rather you're saying, I don't have that belief, then you're inclusive of a lot more people. Now your group's bigger. And even though I just mentioned them and I didn't say anything negative about them, people in the comment section were like, oh yeah, he had to take a jab at the LGBT. And you know what I did to get them back? And this is why I made that video is I go, wait a second, you didn't say plus and two-spirited. And then just to like get them, because you just said LGBT. You didn't say Q plus and you didn't say two-spirited. That's pretty, intolerant or not inclusive. And you know what they said? This is the funniest part. The response was, oh yeah, well, I apologize to anybody who took offense to that or something like that, right? And I just go, you see this? I'm like, do you guys see the problem here? Like, that was a joke, but the people are so that sensitive. And oh, man,
it's really virtue signaling. Have you ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket?
Yeah.
So at the beginning of the staff, the gunnery sergeant is welcoming them to the barracks, and he goes off in his faulty parrot, and he says, "There's no racism here." Then he says, he lists off all racial epithets, and he says, "All you're over here, you're all equally worthless."
All right.
But yeah, I'll take. I won't say everyone's equally worthless, but I will be who I am to someone who's gay, someone who's trans, someone who's black. It doesn't matter. I will treat them as though I would treat another person.
Exactly. Yeah,
and that doesn't mean so. If they are going to be a dick about certain things, I will go straight back at them.
Yeah. And the other thing is like I'm writing a book right now, a booklet on business. And one of the things I talk about in it is how you present your product or service, right? Mm-hmm. And it's super, it relates to this because, I didn't say this in the book, obviously, but the thing is like, let's say that you're getting somebody in business, you're trying to get somebody to buy your product or service. But like in real life, like let's say that you want somebody to support your belief or your case or, get on board with what you're saying or whatever. Okay, well, here's an idea. We want to get people to believe in our side and take our side. Let's go block traffic and make them late for work. Things like this where I go, look, this stuff is just, it's not only just basic common sense. It's in fact, it almost seems like the people in power are so far ahead of us that they're doing things in our time like this to really mess up the left so that they can have these years of the right and then come out on top in 10 years or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like they're almost playing chess down the line. Like, okay, if we get everybody against the left now, the same way the right was in the religious right was in the 90s, then everybody, you know what I mean? Like it almost seems like that sometimes.
It's, I think you're in Hawaii. If what James
No,
was
I'm
saying,
not now. I was in Hawaii when I proposed to my fiance.
okay.
Yeah.
So I've got a very good friend in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, and she is a hardcore Christian.
Okay.
And she's also been involved in the protests against wearing masks and against the shutdowns. And I sent her a message by a guy called Eddie Hall, who's a World Strongman competitor, former competitor for Strongman.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a letter to the British government saying, please, can you reconsider your closure of the gyms? You've opened up the pubs, you've opened up bars. However, I would appreciate it if you would reconsider opening up the gyms, because when I was much younger, going to the gym is what saved me from a life of drugs and all that kind of stuff. And when you read the letter, and it's a huge appeal to emotion, there's very little in there that's actually an argument.
Right.
And it's a huge appeal to emotion. However, the way it's worded, it gets you on his side and it gets you for his position. And I said to her, I'm not going to argue any of your points, which I think are extremely wrong. I think there's a lot of things that you've got wrong in your stats and what you've been saying. However, take a look at what this guy is saying. Take a look at how he's saying it. Take a look at how he's presenting himself. And if you really want to affect political change, you need the people on your side. Your governor of Hawaii, he's not going to do anything if he's got all the support of 55% of the island. And he's not going to care about what you're saying. And everyone else is going to hate you for what you're saying, what you're doing, because you're screwing everything up.
Yeah.
And you're making yourselves obnoxious.
Yeah. Have you been to the island before?
I would love to go there.
So I've been only once, but even before all this stuff happened, when I went last year, we stayed on a military base with family and friends. Not my family, but one of the guys I talked to there, he said, listen, dude, when you go out, be careful. If you hear anybody call you a haole, you need to leave. And it's like a warning. And I was like, what? What is it?
Haole?
And haole, yeah. I've heard other people say it since, but they said it more like Holly. But basically, it's a slur word against white people, and and I never knew that existed until I went there. And he didn't say it like it was some big deal. He just said it like to warn me. He was like, "Hey, listen, there are natives here that are so against white people being on the island that if they call you that, it means trouble." So basically, so then I thought about that, and I was like, "Man, that's wild." So I thought when you said that, it made me start thinking like, that's interesting, because I bet there is a lot of strife going on the island that I don't, I haven't even considered about Hawaii during all this stuff, but I bet you from what I've heard that there's probably some things going on over there right now.
So I haven't seen any strife between native Hawaiians and, let's say, white people. But what has been going on is because they've had so few cases and so few deaths, yet they still have many strict lockdowns. I get that Hawaii their economy is tourism based, so I get why they want to reopen. And I would say that on the whole, Hawaii, from what I've seen, almost no cases, very few deaths. I think they've maybe 19 odd deaths. They should be able to be open and get their internal economy going again. I think at this point, it's just, I actually have no idea what they're doing at this point.
Yeah.
Other than not getting into some pressure from some nut jobs.
Yeah, but what's interesting is the argument that you just talked about in regards to the former weightlifter. That's how I see a lot of those arguments about morality in the Old Testament. I see that they do pull and tug on heartstrings, but I don't actually think there's a lot of merit to them, especially giving the framework, the model that I presented to you that I believe. Because there are multiple times, like I say, when Christ said, like, hey, it wasn't this way from the beginning, right? And he gave it to them because of the hardness of their hearts and things like that. I think that people like Scholar Fiction uses those things because it's easy now to use that to get people on your side. But I don't actually, like I say, I don't think that it's necessarily as big a deal as they've made out, because, and here's why I say that, is because I think there are bigger problems for the Bible than those verses. But I think that they've become so popularized that when a Christian hears those verses, they almost don't take them seriously, because it's like roll your eyes, because it's like, oh, they were reading that same evil Christian website or whatever it was. So they, but I didn't get that when you were saying it. I didn't actually get that that vibe off of you, that you were just using it to kind of get a jab in. Like, I felt like you were actually saying, like, hey, this is a serious concern. Like, what, what's your answer to this question, kind of thing. But I think a lot of other people who are less sincere than you do kind of use it because it tugs on heartstrings.
I do appreciate, thank you. So it's because there's a lot of stuff that I had edited out, which, like this channel, one of the debates, it's lighthearted, apart from what happened with like the police debate that they had 2 days ago. That was brutal, but it's usually lighthearted. So there were a few, I mentioned it very, very briefly in my opening, where there's certain, when actions aren't being taken, that those instances are immoral. When it comes to, I think bringing up the Holocaust, for me, it's too easy. It's being done so often that for me, it's just trampling on their memories and their graves even more and more and more. It was unnecessary. But that sort of inaction by God to stop that. And I don't mind the argument being made that a person who's 15, 16, 20, 25 has shown themselves to be immoral and fine, they deserve to die in a gas chamber. Okay, I don't fully agree with that, but the argument is fine. What I'm not fine with is the baby that is then killed that way. Because at that point, when God is supposed to be the protector of the Jewish tribe, or the Hebrew tribe, at that point, it's like, okay, dude, you should be stepping in now.
Well, are you pro-life, by the way, or pro-choice?
I might be.
You might be.
I might be.
I was about to say that'll affect your argument right there, right?
I find it difficult to justify killing a fetus or aborting a fetus, other than, if there's a threat to the life of the mother, of the host, then sure, that's reasonable.
Sure. I agree with that. And I didn't mean to derail your argument.
No, it's fine. There's certain cases where, I just think it pulls on the heartstrings, where I feel that's, I guess, not a way to argue a case, to appeal to people's emotions. Say, I might be wrong, but don't you feel bad for me? Or don't you feel outraged by this? It's creating fake and phony outrage, which it's not the best way to argue.
Yeah, and I came up with an argument, just like I told you before, like I've never heard anybody argue this, but my argument kind of, because I'm a single father, and my son, well, not anymore, obviously, because I'm getting married, but my son's mother came to me whenever he was young and said, I'm sorry, before he was born, and said, what do you think about us having an abortion? And we weren't together, because it was just, we didn't know each other well. We had just been dating not too long. So anyway, and I was like, no, I'm not. Even though I knew that this was going to cost me a lot, years of my life, all these things, I was like, no, no. And I still knew that she could make that decision without me, right?
Yeah.
But the other, the biggest part of my argument is that, let's say that I was the type of person where I was like, we shouldn't have it, and she wanted to anyway, I would be forced to pay child support to support the child with food for the nourishment of the child and shelter. Mm-hmm. The money's for nourishment and shelter. But the mother, all she's doing when she carries the child is supporting it with nourishment and shelter. But she's not forced to support the child, although the father is forced to support the child. So I think that is a valid argument. Yes.
It is. I do think that when it comes to an abortion, that if you're not going to give the father a right or say in that, then I think Dave Chappelle made the point where he says, then he shouldn't be on the hook for paying for the next 18 years of their life. If he doesn't have a say in that.
If she's not necessarily on the hook for supporting the child, he shouldn't necessarily be on the hook for supporting the child, right? Yeah. Like it seems even that way if you think about it from the aspect of support. Now, and the other thing is there's other laws like if you kill a pregnant mother, it's double homicide or whatever because she wanted to keep the baby. But if she didn't, then it wouldn't be considered homicide for the baby. And that's the other thing where it's like
U.S. law.
Yeah, in U.S. law, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, there's laws in certain states. Some of the states, I'm not sure how many carries that law. I know our state does, where if you kill the mother or if you shoot the mother and it kills the child, then it's murder. Or if you kill both of them, it's double homicide. But if the mother wants it to occur, like at a doctor's office or whatever, then it's not. And so I think those are inconsistent as well. But to get back to what your point was before I derailed it about the Holocaust and things like that is, so, the same thing kind of happened with the Hebrews in Egypt, right? Like you could say, well, if God loved the Hebrews, why would he let them go into Egypt and become slaves and all these things, right?
I'd be fine with that. It's the death. Sorry, it's the death of the firstborn in Egypt, of the firstborn males. I would say the Jewish or the Hebrew slaves, where the Egyptians went and killed them. I'd say, dude, what the hell? What the heck?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing: is let me ask you this, or let me just point this out to you. You know that when God made his pact with the Hebrews, that he told them, and I'll get, because there's two separate points there, right? There's the one about the Holocaust and everything that happened after, and then there's what happened before. But like when God made his they call it a testament, right? But it's a contract. That's what I tell people. It's like a legal binding contract. He says to them, to the Hebrews, like the Israelites, he's like, hey, look, today I'll make a contract with you guys. Okay, as long as you follow the terms and conditions, I'll keep my side. And if you don't, then in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 28, he says, but if you don't, and then he goes through, there will be curses that come on you and these kind of things because you've broken the contract. It's kind of the same thing as like to me, this is how it seems like, well, if you follow gravity, but if you don't, this thing will happen to you, that kind of thing. And I know you may not see the moral law, obviously, as being the objective thing that I see it as, but I do think that that could potentially explain some of it, is that in breaking a contract with the greatest conceivable being is kind of more severe than like and here's the way I'll put it, is that if I were to punch my little brother, right, I probably wouldn't get in that much trouble. If I punched my mother, it'd be a little more. If a cop showed up and I punched him, it'd be more. And if he hauled me in front of a judge and I punched the judge, there's going to be some serious consequences. Now, that's what I'm saying. Now, think about the creator of the entire universe, right? I think that there's a higher significant, it's more significant the higher you go. So I think you could probably agree with that.
To that, I would say, what could I do to a being that powerful? Or what is there that I can do that would really affect him?
I don't know if it's actually affecting him, right? I think I think that if you were to look at a being like this, right, who's trying to communicate with human beings, right? I like to use the example of a video game. Say that I created a video game, right? I'm not only in a different place, like I'm not even in the same plane. Like if you think about the characters in the game, just say that they're conscious or whatever, like just so that's an analogous. But I created this game, and say that I have the rules of the game are, there's the gravity rule where if you fall into the hole, you fall down and die or whatever. Or if I have all these rules, let's say, right, to the game. I built it into the game. Now think about somebody looking back at me and saying, well, why is this the rule? It's like, well, because I'm the standard of rules. Like everything that I created flows from my nature, from what I wanted it to happen, right? I created the thing. And so getting back to what was your question? I'm sorry. Just so I can get it right.
Oh, it was what is there that I could do that could actually affect the path? Yeah.
Right. And I don't necessarily think that it's about affecting, right? I think it's more like there are the rules to the, like there are laws to the universe. Not only, I don't think that we just have empirical senses, right? I think that we have like intuit. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm saying, because we hopefully will debate this, maybe somewhere in September, which is where this is where I'd probably have the disagreement with you, because up until now, I think we've mostly done everything except religion. And also what you're saying now, it's as a fair heads up, you kind of showing your hand.
Yeah, I understand.
Which is why I would very much disagree with, this is where I would probably come into and contend with you about the rules, and how the rules, which I would say, yeah, you've made the rules, and now let's take a look at the rules you've made and let's see if they are moral or not.
Well, let me stop you right there, because that's kind of, I think that's kind of the problem, is you're asking, so define moral right there, right? What do you mean when you say moral? Because if you mean preferences, right, that's going to be different.
No, I wouldn't say preferences. No. Preferences is too vague. It's too.
Well, that's what open. A lot of like my atheist friends define morality as preferences,
And I would disagree with them.
Okay. Go ahead.
Where I wouldn't say morality is what I prefer over what you prefer. It is daylight over here. That is amazing.
Oh, you can. Hey, if you got to go, man, take off, brother.
No, I'm up already. That's the thing. I'm up already.
Okay.
When it comes to morality, I would take a look at what serves our culture and society best. Theft does not. Stealing does not. Kindness, compassion. In cricket, we use the term the benefit of the doubt.
When so by moral, you mean whatever serves the society the best?
Even then, it's it'll be going back to the moral landscape, Sam Harris's moral landscape, where whatever promotes well-being for humanity the best.
So is it for the majority? Is it whatever increases well-being for the most amount of people? Would that be it?
I know the trap I'm setting for myself. Where I'm aware. I'm aware of that. I'm aware of the trap that's being set, because it's in his book. He talks about two different situations where one it's absolute misery and the other one is bliss. Bliss, the best possible scenario. And what I would advocate is moving all of humanity towards a better scenario, creating less harm. So when it comes to, again, we've talked about theft, we've talked about murder and perjury, homosexuality. It's how can we create a society that is beneficial to everyone, where we mitigate as much suffering as possible.
Okay, so by moral, you define moral to mean mitigating as much suffering as possible? You see why the reason why I'm asking that is because if you say we must judge whether God's rules are moral, I need to know what that means. If it means that you decrease the amount of suffering, then we might be saying we might be equivocating on the term moral.
Okay, so it would be mitigating as much suffering as possible while promoting as much well-being as possible.
Okay, let me ask you this then.
Yes, go for it.
Here's the trap, right? Okay, and say that Stalin or someone says, well, if we just kill 2 million people in the long run, we will promote the well-being for 450 million people or 10 billion people or 150 billion just by murdering 20 million people or whatever. Do the consequences justify? Yeah, go ahead.
That's utilitarianism. I think that's the term it is.
Yeah,
utilitarianism.
Or just consequentialism, really.
Consequentialism, which is where I would, again, I would say no. I would say that's not a moral way of going about things, because, or my question would be, how are you killing these two? I think first was, how are you going to kill these 2 million people?
Well, say that, because your thing was like promoting the most well-being possible with decreasing the amount of harm possible or whatever. And I'm saying, well, the promotion of the most amount of well-being would be to do this one thing, right? And say he just dropped a nuke, so they didn't really suffer. It just blew them all up or whatever. And that's what I'm saying is, I don't think that's moral. You know.
Again, I would say that's not moral, because the second part of it is why it's important to have those two parts, where it's to mitigate as much suffering as possible while promoting as much well-being. So in that, you're saying dropping the nuke, and let's say
that's why.
So let's say we have a way to get rid of that nuclear radiation. So we go down the slippery slope of let's kill people certain people in order to maximize the well-being of others. And that is, and we saw that in Russia, where I don't think that they went out and shot people on purpose, but their policies and the way they went about trying to maximize the well-being of the most people, for all people, was detrimental to a great number. So I do think it depends on the manner in which you're going to do it and how you're going to do it.
Yeah, but even I can just take the trolley problem, something simple, and just say, and just say, hey, listen, you got one guy, he's standing on a bridge, right? You can throw him off, he will hit a lever, and you'll save people, say 10 people for the sacrifice of one person, right? It promotes the most well-being and it discourages the most suffering, right? Then that would be moral to do in that situation. But for me, because I take a mostly deontological view, that no, it'd still be wrong to kill that guy.
Yes.
Because you're killing somebody and murder's wrong. You see, and that's why I say, I've got this book from my I took Ethics 110, and the book in it is, I forget, it's called Moral Reasons or something like that, but are elements of moral ethics or something like that. Elements of moral ethics, I think. But there's a passage in it on the death penalty where it goes into all these people, all the like philosophers in history. It goes into like Hobbes and Shaw and all these guys, and it goes, these guys supported a deontological position where it's like, hey, look, you know, this is wrong because of rules, basically. And these guys supported the consequentialist view. And then they made an argument that was really good that, hey, both should be used, right? The deontological view is so that we can justify, the capital punishment, but the consequentialist view, because it discourages things like murder and rape, it's kind of like a deterrent. It's like, well, hey, if you do these things, this will happen because of the deontological rules. But it's still consequentialist in that way, that the consequentialist view kind of acts as a deterrent, where the deontological view kind of justifies what justification of punishment, those types of things. So that's why I don't think that. Here's another thing, just to kind of go back to what you were saying before about, well, we need to look and see if God's laws are moral. The problem I see with that is, and I've always said this, is that I see a problem with, are you familiar with normative ethics? It just means like what we should or ought do, right?
I've heard of them.
So normative, all normative in this context means normative just means should or ought. So
okay, is ought problem?
Not necessarily that problem specifically, but like there's two sections, right, of morality. There's descriptions and normativity. The descriptions, they just describe what happens. A guy killed a guy. That doesn't say whether it's wrong or not. It's just describing what happened. The normative view just says he should not have done that. That's a normative claim, right? So what I'm saying is I don't think that it's appropriate to judge an absolute perceiving being with human normative morality. You get what I'm saying? Because I think you could because I think you could actually say, hey, God is a super big meanie or something like that. And I think you could actually
say that,
yeah, and I could totally understand, like, oh yeah, from your human perspective, that does make sense. But that's the whole thing, is that you can't, a lot of atheists do this without even thinking about it, I think, they do the taxi cab fallacy, where they go, okay, I want to do an internal critique of your God. So I'm just pretending like everything your God says is true. And look what he did here. Yeah, but keep in mind that he's all-knowing, right? And he's an absolute perceiver and the greatest possible being and all these things. Well, no, but I don't believe that about him. Well, hold on. You can't jump out of the internal worldview critique when you get to something you disagree with. The thing is, you have to understand this is an all-knowing, all-perceiving person. And so if you're going to critique him from an internal critique perspective, you have to take those into consideration and say, well, hold on. It's like if somebody were to say, like if I were to tell you a man is cutting a girl with a knife, you would say probably that's evil. But if I told you that he was a surgeon and he was going to save her life, you'd probably say, well, no, that's good. But it all depends on a little amount of information that I gave you at the end. God is an absolute perceiver, so he has all information. So from that perspective, it would make sense to say, well, God seems to be wrong about what he's doing here. Make that normative claim. But again, like I say, I think that it's probably not the best reasoning to judge an absolute perceiver from a non-absolute perceiver's perspective, if you get where I'm coming from.
I get what you're saying from my side, because I said I granted John this earlier, because if we're going to have a conversation about God, I'm going to have to concede, for the sake of the discussion, come to the table saying, okay, he exists, and let's examine his character.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to come to me and you're going to say that you have the gospel of Christ and you want me to believe in Christ, I'm going to say to you, okay, so let's open up your book, which has the claims in it, and I'm going to say, let's look at the claims, what's going on over there, and I'm going to have to make a decision on if I believe this character of Jesus and of God to be morally good, if I would be willing to, before I even get to worship them, would I be willing to follow what they're saying? Would I be willing to, do I agree with what their stance is on slavery, for example? Do I agree with their stance on marriage, divorce, and homosexuality? And if I can't get past that, and if I see that not only that, but they're doing other things, I'm going to have to use my own moral standards to judge this person.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I said I see that you could make an argument for why he doesn't meet your moral standards. But the problem is that if you are doing an internal worldview critique, you have to understand that his nature is the standard of morality. So that's why I said, what do you mean when you say moral? Because a lot of my friends who say, God is immoral, and I say, what is moral? And they say, my preferences. And I go, so you're saying that God doesn't align with your preferences? And they go, yeah. And I say, I can agree with that. That doesn't say anything to me. Or like God doesn't promote, like, here's a point that might really help is Skylar said to me about 4 years ago when he was a deist, and we had a debate. He said, I'm more humane than God. And I said, if by humane you mean human, then I agree with you. Like, okay. I
don't think that's what he meant.
he didn't just straight up say that's what I meant, but what he means is like has human empathy or something like that for other people, right? And I think that it's fair from a human perspective to have these intuitions, right? But at the same time, let's say if it is true that pick anything, murder or whatever is objectively wrong. If it is true, then it kind of doesn't matter what we think about it, because we're just so limited in our perspectives that we're going to judge things from our limited perspectives, and they're going to be biased, of course, right? So, I mean, like I say, I think you can have I can see where you're coming from. Let's just put it that way. I think that atheists, I often tell atheists, I'm like, I definitely not only see where you're coming from, like I think that it's a decent argument, right? I never would go into things like that though, because I always thought it's just, it never seemed right to me to judge an absolute perceiver from a limited perspective, especially on human normative claims. So like you might say, well, as a human, a fellow human, you must follow this standard or you're immoral, but if it is true that God created everything outside of himself, then everything emerged from him and his nature. Then the only thing to go back to or to look to as a plumb line, right, is the nature of God. Now, if that's not true, and you just judge it from an atheist point of view, like you're reading the story as an atheist, and you go, well, that's wrong. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing an internal worldview critique, everything from outside of God emerged from the nature of God, and thus the nature is the standard of all things. So I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but if you get where I'm coming from.
I think where I get where you're coming from, the thing is the only way we can see the character and nature of God would be by the Bible. And if that's the only way we can try and get inside the mind and try to understand what his character is. But I did want to ask you was, how do you know that God is moral? Like, how did you come to the conclusion that God is the standard for morality?
See, it's kind of like, I'm trying to put this in it's kind of like saying, how do you know that the standard of morality is the standard of morality? Because like, if you are doing an internal worldview critique and you're looking at, you're like, okay, I'm in the worldview. God created this universe. Everything came from him. And so he is the absolute standard of everything around. And you say, but how do I know the absolute standard is the absolute standard? If you're but if you're from outside saying, as an atheist, like from your perspective, like, well, how do you know if you don't, if you're not assuming that worldview, that would be a different.
How did you come to that conclusion? It's how did you know that this is the standard?
Okay. So just from so if I'm not doing an internal worldview critique and I'm just like saying, like, from a person in the world that doesn't know anything, how do you go about this? I would appeal to revelation and personal experience, and partially intuition, like guilt and conscious and things like that. But I don't think those things are necessarily inerrant. But I think that scripture, for example, you talk about learning about God through revelation or whatever, or scripture. I want you to keep in mind, though, that God approaches people where they are, right? So I could totally admit that the people in the Bible might have actually thought the world was flat, although it's not that apparent. There are metaphorical things like the foundations of the earth and things like that, right? But I could totally just admit it and say, okay, they did believe that. It doesn't change my world at all, because God approaches people where they are. And so if he goes to somebody who believes the world is flat, he's not going to say, this is a thing that I use where I go, he told people the hairs on your head are numbered. Because if he would have told them or if he would have told them that their DNA molecules are numbered, it wouldn't have mattered. They wouldn't have known what he was talking about, right? So he just goes to them where they are and reveals.
Now that you bring that up, I'm kind of kicking myself for that, because I did want to bring it up that in the Bible, Old and New Testament, there's nothing in there about anything about medicine or science that would have helped us, that would have preserved life.
I don't know. What about washing your hands?
I'll say like clean your knife. I'll say before you perform surgery, clean your knife.
Well, there is actually there's a lot of people in the Middle East that didn't wash their hands before they ate, and that's one of the laws in the Old Testament is that you should wash your hands before you eat. I know it's small, it's minor, right?
When Jesus comes along and says it's not what goes into your body that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of it. I was like, that is actually beautifully and well said, but people were going to misinterpret that about when it comes to hygiene. So that's,
right.
I mean, that does leave a lot of. If you don't understand what he's saying is, having a bacon and cheese hamburger doesn't make you a sinner, doesn't make you unworthy in the eyes of God. It's you using the Lord's name in vain. It's you cheating on your spouse and beating your kids. That's what makes you unworthy.
Exactly.
That's what it's actually saying. However, that was left up to interpretation that, what was it? You don't have to wash your hands. Undoing any good work that may have been done, saying wash your hands before you eat or perform surgery. Germ theory would have been nice to know a few thousand years ago. Gravity, calculus would have been.
But imagine, but that's my whole point is, imagine God going to these people who are barbaric, as I mentioned before, they're just barbaric people, and he's trying to wean them off of some of the evil things they're doing. So he's regulating things. And then he goes, and there are these invisible things that if you get them on your skin and you eat them, like I don't think that they could have even grasped that. It's potentially, but again, it's just like the babies in the gas chamber thing. It's like, I don't know what happened there. For all I know, in the flood and the gas chamber and all that stuff, for all I know, God swooped them right out of there or took their soul before they could experience it. I don't know what happened, so I can't say, right? And I know that's probably not satisfying. Huh?
No, because I don't believe that there's a soul. That's...
Well, sure, yeah.
It's, again, from my perspective, from my worldview, like there's no soul. It's the baby goes in there, and you might say that the soul was saved and went to heaven. But still the physical presence and conscious being that was there in the gas chamber and ovens would have suffered. And I think I had a few other examples where the only other entity that could have saved a person from death would have been God. There was an attack there's a city just north of where I stay called Naharia, where I think they were Palestinians. They snuck around the border on a boat. And while they were attacking one of the families, the mother hid in a cupboard with her baby. And because she was trying to stifle the screams, she held the baby tightly into her chest, and unfortunately the baby suffocated. And I think that may have been a bit too dark to have brought up during the discussion with John. But at that moment, I would have said, should not have God, if you were a moral being, not save the baby's life, so the baby didn't suffocate, that the baby had just enough air to breathe. You get what I'm saying?
Well, yeah. That's kind of a human. Yeah, that is kind of a secular perspective, and the reason why I say it is because from the atheist worldview, this is all you've got is this life, right? So the child.
Oh yeah.
So the child losing their life is kind of the ultimate bad, because it's like now they don't have anything, right? But again, like I say, from the inter-worldview critique, because if you're saying that God should have or whatever, you have to look at it from the perspective of the person who believes God exists to go, okay, well, at some point when the mother was holding that child closely, God took the life of that child. But the child not only, number one, not only went directly to God, right? But also you have to think, like, is limited experience of suffering, like, because that gets us into suffering, right? And I think that it's a good point that limited experience of suffering compared to a I didn't keep in mind, I didn't used to think this was a good argument, but I do now, and I'll tell you why. A limited experience of suffering is nothing compared to a lifetime of let's say bliss or something like that. And I used to didn't think that was the case, but if you think about it like this, like, have you ever had a dream where in the dream you were suffering, right? Like pretty bad, like you were having some type of nightmare or something where it was pretty harsh on you, right? Well,
I'm studying chemistry. It's a living work, man.
Right. Well, if you ever have like a terrible dream where like you're suffering in the dream, like somebody's doing something to you or your family in the dream that really hurts you, and then you wake up and then you think about it again in 6 or 8 years, and you're like, I hadn't even thought about that. It's like it was totally nothing to you. Like you're like, oh, I don't even, and I'm like, think about the, so anyway, I know that's probably not satisfying, but I'm saying there are answers. Yeah.
So it's not satisfying because then it comes to the sacrifice of Jesus, because that in itself would say that 3 days max in hell versus an eternity of being in heaven beforehand, say 30 odd years on earth, and then 3 days in hell, which would have been the real sacrifice, and then still eternity in heaven. So that would mean that him dying on the cross and that supposed sacrifice, that's nothing. It's, are you willing to have a bad dream so that everyone, for him, it would be, as you said, a bad dream. Nothing more than a bad dream. That's not a sacrifice that would atone for anything.
Well, keep in mind that let's look at it from the perspective of the video game again, like I said before. Okay, think about it like this. I create a video game.
Yeah.
And I create these characters. All right. The characters, there's no way I can talk to these characters. I can't reach them. I have to use the means of the world. So there's many things where people go, well, why would God do this? Like I see somebody in the debate go, why would he kill them with fire and brimstone in Sodom and Gomorrah instead of just zapping them or why, things like this where I'm like, the thing is that God uses the means of the world. So for example, if I wanted to interact with the characters in the video game, I would use some type of mod chip or something because I'm a physical being and they're virtual beings. I can't reach into the screen and manipulate things. I have to use the means of the game, which are mod chips or codes or whatever, right? So somebody could go, well, why would he mod? That's weird. Why didn't he just reach in here and do it? It's like, because it's not even on the same plane of existence. You have to use the means of the world.
I would agree with you that if his goal was to, let's say, nuke the entire town of Sodom, or the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah, why not? Why not nuke them or have an asteroid hit them? I would say, yeah, why not? If the goal is to kill everyone, sure, why not? However, and I'm not saying you've made this claim. However, I'm aware that the flood in New Orleans was supposed to be...
Hold on one second. Can you, just so I don't lose this point and keep your point about the flood in New Orleans, but the point with Christ is that he's God incarnate. He's God become a character in the game to serve a purpose in order to make a way for other characters in the game to get right with the person outside of the game, if that makes sense. I'm trying to put it in terms that we can understand. So,
so I do remember what I said. Okay, so when it comes to that, so your characters, if we can maybe just flesh out this video game analogy.
Sure.
What happens at so they would have been set to last for X amount of, say, of years in the video game, what happens when their timer runs out and they have to exit the game somehow? As in, they'd go to heaven or they would go to hell.
Mm-hmm.
Video game heaven or video game hell, however would you like to phrase that.
Mm-hmm. What was the question? I'm sorry.
How would you? So, is there a video game heaven and a video game hell in your scenario?
Yeah, so I'm just saying I'm saying that the video game is just like the world, right? I'm just using that as an example to show you the difference in planes of existence,
yes,
right? And the distinction between creation, right? Because I think that applies. Like, I think that's a hefty distinction, because, like, even in moral claims, right? Like, it just shows that, like, judging something. Whatever, like, I'm the creator of a game. I'm the standard of everything. Everything is an emergent property of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's kind of what I was pointing out with the game analogy. But just imagine, for the sake of argument, that it's the same as the world. Like, there's conscious creatures, there's heaven and hell. And again, I don't think that, just make this one last point here before you go on, because I don't want you to straw man my position, is I don't think heaven and hell are what most people think they are, right? I think that the language that's used in the Bible is anthropomorphic. So it's just a way for humans to relate good and bad. And so, for example, with hell, it's infinitely dark but full of fire. Those things don't necessarily fit together, fire and infinite darkness. I think that it's just a way to say, like, hey, look, you know how we fear being burned and darkness? That's what hell's like. And then heaven, which is probably going to be a spiritual place, is streets of gold and pearl gates and things. Those are just things that people who in poor cultures look to as good things, like a pearl gate and a street that is made out of gold bricks and things. And like I say, I think that it's anthropomorphic language, but I don't think that it's necessarily like I think that Dante kind of ruined a lot of people's perspectives on hell. So just so you know, ahead of time.
Yeah. So it's, just because no one's ever, from my perspective, no one's ever gone to hell or heaven and come back to tell the tale. I don't know.
Well, we wouldn't trust them, right? Because plenty of people said they went to heaven and hell. But we don't really trust their opinion.
I would say your brain was starved of oxygen while you were dying. That's what was happening. So I would say in heaven you're with God and you're enjoying yourself. In hell, let's say, is you're not enjoying yourself.
Exactly. I would just say that that God's absent. Like, you're in a world that's absent from God. So basically, but with God comes health and all the other benefits of being sustained.
So what was it? I was talking about New Orleans. We're talking about using things that are there in the program itself to interact with the characters. And again, which is why I don't strawman and say that you have said this.
Sure.
But I'm aware of some American pastors that said that the flood in New Orleans was the result of God being angry with the citizens.
Right.
And as a punishment, I think it was Pat Robertson. I could be mistaken. I said it was a punishment for Ellen DeGeneres living there and the homosexual acts that were going on in, I think it was the French Quarter, which from what I understand was unaffected.
Yeah, well, here's the thing about that is when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues with God and says, hey, listen, well, what if there's 15 righteous people there? What if there's 30 righteous people there? Would you destroy the city? And he goes, no. He goes, what if there were 20? He goes, no, I wouldn't do it. He goes, what if there were only 10 righteous people there? And he goes, no, I wouldn't destroy the city for the sake of the 10 righteous people. And the whole point of that exchange was that that God doesn't destroy the righteous along with the wicked, right?
Yeah. So the point of what comes to New Orleans is that the place that was.
Now, hold on, one more thing, because there is a verse that says it rains on the righteous and the wicked alike, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that God does that, because again, God talked with Abraham and saved Lot, right, and his daughter. So that's kind of one of the points is that
Lot was saved, so it didn't rain on Lot.
Yeah, so that's what. Well, no, not necessarily. I'm saying like, all right, so because of the fall, God has stepped back from what He said, and He saw it was good when He created, and He has stepped back because of the fall of mankind, and all kind of things like diseases and things have fallen into the world. But it wasn't that way from the beginning, as Christ said. All right. So
yes. So for me, when it comes, I do enjoy that that phrase. It rains on the just and unjust alike.
Yeah.
I mean, it just says that, just a way to explain that, bad things happen to everyone.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, it's more, and I take the stance that the universe just doesn't care. It has, and it's very difficult to wow. I think I might have to say goodnight soon because I need to go to sleep.
Yeah, that's fine. I get it.
I think it's very dangerous to, and it's wrong to
Anthropomorphize.
Yeah, that's the word. Yeah, the universe, because it's nothing like us. So to say that the universe doesn't care, it's even itself it's nonsensical. That being said, the universe just doesn't care about you or me. It does what it does, and it will rain as it will rain. It will flood as it will flood, and there will be earthquakes and meteor showers and asteroids, just because that's the way the universe works.
No, I agree with that, but I would say because God has stepped back from humanity, right? Not because, like the same thing with the video game, right? I say that when I created the video game, like there are certain consequences to the game, like you can't be in, like you're not in time, right? So that's an effect of virtual reality, is that if I hit pause, time isn't, there's not temporal moments, right? I have to hit unpause and then resume, but it's not temporal in the same way it is for me. And I would say that the world is like that as well. That especially that God stepped back from the world when the fall happened. So He kind of said to, I have to look the exact verse, but it's in Genesis right after the fall of humans. He says that now the ground is cursed. And so I would just say that like floods and tsunamis and things like this happen because of the fall. Same thing with, diseases and things. I don't think that it's like when somebody gets a disease, it was that God diseased them or something like that, right? Christ kind of talked about that whenever they asked, like, why is this person blind? Is it because what their parents did, or what, which parent did something wrong? And he was like, no, it's not because of what their parents did, right? And so, that kind of idea is that I don't take that same perspective that God, like the flood came on because there were evil people in the area or something like that. Because if that were the case, right, it wouldn't. It's like it seems that He would have flooded like Mecca or Medina or some mosque or something, right? It's like, or some.
Yeah, the argument should be made that why isn't God flooding and raining fire and brimstone down on a variety of places?
Right. Yeah,
it's like we're living on an Earth which has cooling plates, it has plate tectonics, and that's why we have earthquakes. We have a weather system which accounts for hurricanes and typhoons and monsoons, just because that's just the weather system that we have.
No, I agree.
I would just say, why do these things happen? I would just say physics.
Yeah, and I agree. And one thing that I will say before we go is I have another one of those views where I haven't heard anybody really go into this at all. I've talked to a few people about it, but I have one of those my own personal views again about supernatural and natural things, which is different from it came about through somebody asking me, show me God right now. If God exists, show me right now. And I thought about it, and I said, my first response was, so you want me to show you a supernatural being in natural terms? Then that would just be a natural thing. And they thought about it, and they were like, Yeah, I guess you're right, but how do you know? So then I thought about that, and so I've been kind of developing my supernatural natural distinction, and it's kind of like, even if God rained fire and brimstone, it could have been some volcanic activity or some type of thing, right? Where the event was God using the means of the natural world, but the cause of the event was supernatural. But that supernatural, because it's like you were saying, I think I could agree with you about plate tectonics and all those things, but keep in mind, you can't show a supernatural thing in natural terms, because then it'd be natural, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but then it comes to the next question, which would be, if there's no way for us to detect God through any natural means, what's the difference between that kind of a God and no God existing whatsoever? If, for just practical terms, what's the difference between either one?
Well, let's take an example like Christ walking on water, right? Say that I created this video game and I became a character in the game, but I had a mod chip, so I used it so that the gravity was not 9.8 meters per second squared, right, or something like that, right? So I used the means of the world, the mod chip, to be able to walk on water. The claim that I did it naturally, though, like it's just a natural thing that I walked on water, is dumb. But if there is an all-powerful, like, supernatural being that caused these things to happen, that isn't then a dumb claim. So I guess the difference would be that, are you asking like, because I want to get at your specific question, like, were you just asking that, how would it be different?
Yeah, what's, in practical terms, what's the difference? Because if we can't detect God, so in this instance, God can influence and affect the world, but he does so through natural means, which means that we can't detect his presence. Versus from my perspective, a God that doesn't exist, which there's no way for me to detect him because he's not there. For me, practically, there's no difference between a God that you can't detect and there being no God.
Well, the difference I would say is that you can attribute supernatural causation, but not supernatural means, because, like I say, I can only interact in the virtual world through virtual means, right? But you could look at something like, if I were a character in the video game and I saw a guy walking on water, for example, although it may have been natural means that caused that was actually happening, I then could infer that the cause of that incredible feat that doesn't typically occur, what we would call a miracle, is a supernatural cause. Whether it's using you said, so I'll give you another example. Say like fine tuning, right? The fact that the universe is orderly. Now, it could be completely orderly in a natural universe, right? Like there's certain ways that it could be disorderly without a God, right? The point is that if you look at the argument, or if you look at the fact that things are orderly, you could say, well, is it more probable that we have an orderly universe out of chaos, or that there is an orderer to the universe? You see what I'm saying? I know that gets into a deeper topic, but I just wanted to point out. But I just want to point out that, like, I think that you can look at things and go, okay, this seems to have a supernatural causation. Whether, like I say, I don't think people have thought about that enough, the distinction between supernatural and natural. And so that's why you get a lot of arguments like the one I always hear, that, well, show me God right now, that kind of thing.
I don't buy that. I just hear of I don't think that's an effective argument. Show me God now.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. So
that's not how it works. It's not. I mean, there's certain things that do give me a lot of pause to consider. It's why I suppose you'd call me a soft atheist. It's we work in 4 dimensions, and if we had to draw a square, any 2D shape, that shape would have no reference for us. If that shape, that square, became sentient, it would have no way to comprehend us being 3-dimensional and having the 4th dimension of time. That it would have no way to discern that. So there may very well be something that is above us, in the 5th, 6th, 7th, however many dimensions above us, and we would perhaps call that God. And the thing is, there's no way I can disprove that, and I think it's worthwhile to think about that, at least for me. Which is why I take the stance that I'm just unconvinced by the arguments for a deity.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely understand it because, like I said before, well, yeah, you may not know this about me, but so I haven't always been, just a Christian. So that's kind of the thing, is that growing up, I didn't have a family that, like, my grandma would take us to church and stuff like that sometimes, but my parents never really went, and so it wasn't like a big thing for me. See, like with a lot of atheists, I realized that a lot of times they grew up in Christian families, and I'm not saying you because I don't know your story, of course, but so I can definitely see the perspective better than some Christians can. But so I don't blame you at all for being skeptical and saying, I'm not convinced, that makes total sense to me. I would just say that, like, my biggest problem is finding consistency, right? It's like, you listened to that Vosh debate the other night, right? Vosh and Destiny.
I have to actually go back and listen to that, because the chat in there, and I was at work, so I wasn't really supposed to be listening to that.
Yeah.
So it was a bit quiet, and wow.
Yeah, there were like 5,000 people in the chat. So, but yeah, so he said something that really see, because I'm always making connections to arguments and things, and so we use this argument where, so Martin Rees and these other royal astronomer and these other guys that go into the fine tuning and all the different, not only the fine tuning of the universe, but the probability of life forming and all these things. And they find out, like, oh, it's so infinitesimally small that this is possible, that it's almost zero. Like, it's a trillion and a trillion, 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 and they just keep going, percent chance. So the other night when I'm listening to Vosh, and I'm making a connection, he goes, well, look what happens to these white people in these cities and blah, blah, blah. And he goes, and the person who was summarizing the text said that it was a 1 in a trillion chance that it wasn't because of racism. That's what they said, 1 in a trillion. And then I thought, my light just flickered. My light just flickered in here. And anyway.
No, that's fine. But that's argument that's ridiculous.
Yeah, but then I thought about it. I'm like, well, if that's convincing, but then I'll give him like a fine-tuning argument where it's way more improbable, and he'll go, yeah, but I still don't buy it. It's like, well, then you can't use that as an argument that 1 in a trillion is good. It's like,
I guess there needs to be consistency. And to be honest with you, I don't find the whole fine-tuning argument convincing at all. I mean, I'm aware of, when it comes to the statistics and probability, but I'm not so certain that your side's making the point it thinks it's making.
Okay.
But for the simple reason that what you could, if I was being nice and kind and generous, I could say, all right, I'll move my stick to being a deist, but now convince me of Christianity.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. It doesn't get you to Christianity. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
But even so, I'm not convinced by that argument at all.
Sure. I understand, and I'm not. That gets us way into deeper topics, and I know we don't really have time right now, so that might be a good place to put it down. But I really appreciate the conversation, and let me ask you this: do you know? אתה מדבר עברית?
כן.
כן? Oh, okay.
כבר פה
So
10 שנים, אני למדתי לדבר כמו ישראלי.
Israel, yes, Israel. Where do you live at in Israel? Or
In
no, you
Haifa.
don't have to tell me if you don't want to tell me. What was
I
that?
just told you Haifa. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Yeah. So maybe, I enjoy having conversation with you. I'd like to learn more Hebrew too. You got any resources or anything that you suggest? Because you probably didn't know before you went, did you?
I went to a secular Jewish day school when I was.
Okay.
When I say secular, I mean it's. When it comes to Judaism, there's both the cultural identity and there's also the religion. So I grew up. We would have the Friday night meal. We would go to the synagogue on the high holy days.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that,
yeah, I'm familiar. That's what David Berlinski says. He said that he grew up a secular Jew and he talks about it. So I'm kind of familiar.
So I went to a Jewish school where it's regular education. However, we did have Hebrew and Jewish studies. That was the main difference. So I did know some Hebrew when I came here. And because I did what's called making Aliyah, which means I immigrated to Israel, the government paid for my Hebrew studies in a place called an Ulpan. So I ended up doing 2 Ulpans before I joined the army. So if you really want to learn the language, come join the army.
Right, yeah. No, so it'll be interesting to talk to you though in the future because if you know Hebrew, then that's interesting because you're probably not as familiar with ancient Hebrew, but it's interesting to go through some of the verses in the Bible, like with some of the scholars I like that talk about like the Nakash and the B'nai Elohim and all these terms that some people seemingly think they know what they mean, right? But then when you look deeper, like there's way more to it. Like the Nakash in the garden is not
it's a
Nakash. Yes.
Yeah,
It's the
Chet. It doesn't have sound.
Yeah, it's the Chet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have an Afrikaans in Africa. So I was a bit lucky there.
Yeah. So, but anyway, it's interesting because it's like the best usage of that term isn't snake, and seeing where the root of that comes from, being shiny, a shining being, is kind of interesting. I don't know if you've ever considered that, but
I mean, I do know that Hebrew works a lot around the roots of what the root of any word is built around 3 particular letters.
Right, exactly.
And then from there you can, like the root word to say something for mer and your mer marshal, the aleph mem resh, you can build a variety of different words around that depending on how you build it means different things. It all has the same connotation.
Right. Yeah.
But it's just built around that.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing is like, it's like, well, that's why people use serpent, right? Is that it can be used for that. But the more accurate rendering is from the root is something like burnished brass, which is like a shiny, anyway, it'd be some. What is it?
Actually, I worked with that. So it was yesterday morning. I did a lab report, and we used copper, and it's nachoshet. It's
so
the same.
Yeah, so that's interesting because that's why I listen to Heiser and these guys who are just the ancient experts in language, is because they go into it and they go, well, why is the person in Isaiah 14 called the shining son of the morning? And why does it say in the New Testament that Satan can appear as an angel of light? And all these kind of things where it's like, it's all talking about shining and being like luminescent. And then even Christ, the risen Christ is described by John as being this, it says that his feet were like burnished brass, and these kind of things. And he had like this glow to him and all these things. Anyway, he points out all these things from the Old and New Testament and says like, dude, it's way more, it'd be way more correct to talk about shining instead of a snake talking, right? But anyway, that's it seems that go ahead.
I was gonna say something needs to have spoken. It would be, I can believe a talking snake far more readily than I can believe a shining rod of copper.
Well, no, it's a shining being, right?
Shining, it's
Because there's three terms that can be used for Nakashas: a serpentine being, a shining being, or deceiver. And he thinks that shining deceiver is much more of an appropriate thing to talk about, considering the rest of Scripture. Because the snake language is used about Dan, and it's used about these other people. But they're not actual snakes, right? It's just kind of like a symbolic thing to use to say, like, hey, look, you know how we're scared. It's another anthropomorphic thing. It's like, hey, you know how we're scared of snakes, It's like,
yeah, I mean, it's because it's ubiquitous to walk on its belly on the rest of its day. I think that's either was something very, very specific, or it was referring to snakes or serpents. So that's...
Yeah, he goes through that. He talks about it, and he kind of refers to the fact that humans are so afraid of snakes that it's used as a symbol, right? But snakes in the ancient world weren't actually, they were kind of used as protectors in a lot of places. Like if you look at a lot of older stuff in the ancient world, they have snakes all over them, because even though they're feared, they're looked at as protectors. And like the Red Cross uses them, and they talk about how that symbol goes so far back. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. I've
always been fascinated by that, because I've heard two stories about where the snake comes from. There's one story that comes from the Bible where the people of Israel have done something wrong again in the desert, and then God sends a bunch of snakes to attack them. And then I think Aaron gets the command to go take a snake on a rod, and then if people look at that, they will be saved. It's something, I know I'm probably butchering it.
Yeah.
But that's one of the sources where it comes from. And also a Greek physician where that was his symbol, Aesculaps, whatever his name is, that was his symbol, a snake.
Well, I think that you would be actually kind of impressed by the work of people like Heiser, because he's not afraid. He just said one day, he just goes, look, you know what? I'm tired of people telling me to protect Christians from their Bibles. And I love that line. And he goes like, hey, look, this whole thing about Paul talking about women covering their hair, there's actual Greek medical texts that talk about how they believe that the women's hair had something to do with fecundity and holding sperm cells or something like that. It was some old text where he was like, they were just wrong about it. And he goes, but that's what they believed, and that's why they put this thing in the text, that women's hair had something to do with their genitalia. And so anyway, like, he's just one of those guys where he talks like, he's like, dude, I'm not going to protect people from their Bible. Like, they need to know these things. And like, I can show you actual Greek medical texts that actually say that they think that women cutting their hair will have something to do with them being barren and things like that. So, it's really interesting. Maybe one day we'll go through some of those things on a stream, and you can like give your take on it. And
for different reasons, I do encourage people to read the Bible, depending if they're Jewish or Christian or Muslim. I encourage them for those reasons to actually read what's in there. Obviously, I have different motives than what you do.
Right, I agree.
Why they should read that.
And one of the biggest problems is I don't think that a lot of the things that people find in the Bible, I don't think they're actually problems. Like, oh, they believe the world was flat or something like that. It's like, as I told you before, it's not a problem for me. Things like that. So.
Neither for me. And I had it in one of the things I cut out was, I'm not going to judge those barbarians at the time. I'm not going to, fine, they were barbarians, but I also can understand and realize that that is what was acceptable at that time. Mm-hmm. And I'm fine with that. There's certain things that I'm fine with. I don't mind that there was an improvement on how they treated slaves. What I am saying what they should not have been, I'm saying I don't mind that there was an improvement in the way that they were told to treat slaves. That's fine. You're going to slowly outlaw slavery, but what should have happened is no more slaves. And what I am judging is God, because in Malachi 3:6 it says, "I am consistent," and even I think in the New Testament it says, "I am the same today as I was yesterday, then tomorrow. It's
Right.
okay. So that means that all of this is applicable, which means that slavery is still condoned, and that is a problem. Because we can say, cool, that was an improvement. However, today we know slavery is immoral and wrong.
Right. Well, I think that does work against the most. I think that would probably work against a Jewish person. But like I said, if you have your Messiah or the incarnation of God saying, well, he gave you those laws because of the hardness of your heart, or Moses gave you those laws because of the hardness of your heart, but it wasn't that way from the beginning. I think that is actually a way of reconciling, saying like, hey, listen, you get milk until you can take solid food, kind of thing. So, and you agree with me that incremental change is kind of the way to go, right?
I do, yeah.
I
do. And which is why I said I have no problem saying that Judaic slavery was better than Egyptian slavery. I'd say, yeah, some improvements are being made. And it's, I think, just if we have to bring it to present day, I think that is where the feminism and civil rights movement of, let's say, the 40s, 50s, and 60s has an upper edge on what's going on today, is because it was a slow change and they were pushing for equality. And now what's going on is now we are better than you and we want more.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not they're not looking for a slow change. They're looking for a drastic and immediate change.
Yeah, and it's like if you would disagree with them, it's like they take it as a moral abomination. I said this the other day because I don't know. Do you know Scholar Fiction?
I've seen a few of his debates.
Okay, yeah. So he made this video about a Christian apologist where it looked like he was pleasuring himself to other Christian apologists. Most people don't know about this because it just happened the other day, and he made a fake Christian channel called Skylar the Christian, and he had a video of like Eric Hernandez, who's a Christian apologist, basically pleasuring himself to the thought of inspiring philosophy and capturing Christianity and these other guys. And basically, Skylar says at the end of all his videos, Black Lives Matter, and he does all these like things to show that he's a leftist. And then even after that, though, all of his atheist friends that are liberals, they came out and like attacked him, and they were like, listen, we're going to not, Josh Bowen that's on his show sometimes? Well, Dr. Josh is actually an ancient, he's an Assyriologist. Like he has a PhD, like he's a smart guy. Well, he co-hosts Skylar's show a lot of times. Well, they actually came out and said that they were going to call all the scholars that Josh has had on his channel and tell them that they should disassociate with Josh and like basically go after his job, right? If Skylar didn't take it down, because they thought that he was making fun of gay people because he was insinuating that this Christian apologist might have gay thoughts about other Christian apologists. And he got attacked so hard for that. And I was like, I said on Twitter, I said, dude, you just didn't signal hard enough. And I'm just...
It is. And again, I'm not entirely certain of exactly what's going on there, but if the one guy was pleasuring himself to other Christian apologetics, I would imagine he'd be pleasuring himself to their arguments and not to the person.
Yeah. And that's the thing is...
But the arguments, I would imagine.
Yeah, and he's like, man, they just assume my motive. And I agree with that, but I'm like, dude, if you dance with the devil, you got to be careful. Like, if you're going to hang out with people who are sensitive about everything, you got to be careful not to offend anybody. So, but anyway, yeah, let's do this again, man, sometime whenever you have more time. I know it's going to be a different time of day for you, but I'm trying to work it out.
The thing is, I have a lab report that I have to get on, and I have exams to deal with.
Oh, man.
By the time I'm done with my exams, you'll be getting married. So congratulations.
Yeah, appreciate that. And congrats on getting done with your exam soon, hopefully.
Hopefully. We'll have many years left.
Yeah. Well, it's been interesting, man, and I really appreciate the conversation, and hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Sure. Take care. Thank you very much.
You too. Take care.